Science Fiction Weekly. Short story number 11. Phases of the Moon Base. Short read series. By Neil A. Hogan. Published by Maldek House. Copyright 2017. www.sciencefictionweekly.com. Phases of the Moon Base. By Neil A. Hogan. Lunar Base 1, population 5,000. Laughing happily, the big robot bounced on the lunar surface as it chased after the robot dog. The robot stick, that it had thrown with its robot strength, had gone the full length of the human habitat dome in the low gravity, and the dog-like robot had bobbed its head in anticipation. It bounded after it, rounded the corner and disappeared out of sight. David saw the myriad of footprints the robots had made in the lunar surface, and smiled to himself. It was such a joy to see the robots having fun outside. They were so far away that they were almost like specks. But their comical movements were easy to work out. He pulled the curtains back every morning to see the Blue Earth and Fun robots. He wished he could go out there, but his mummy and daddy had said that they couldn't breathe outside. He couldn't quite understand it. If the air was poison, they could just pump it away, and it would be safe then. Lots of kids wanted to play outside in the dirt, but weren't allowed. Maybe he could find a way to make the other children happy. But he knew that he would learn all about it in school, and then he'd find a way to go and play with the fun robots. And, maybe he would find out where they had come from. Perhaps Earth had sent them. Lunar Base 1, population 10,000. The little robot bounced a few times on the lunar surface, following its subroutine, traversing the years of indentations it had made, chasing after the robot dog. A ring in the dirt had developed around the habitat dome, and the trajectory for the robot bone had changed slightly, but the act remained the same. Run on the south side, throw on the west side, pick up on the north side and recharge with the sun on the lit east side. David stared at the boring display. Those robots drove him crazy. Every morning for over 15 years he'd seen them at his window. Perhaps even longer. He guessed it saved people setting their alarms. He'd chosen environmental science. He had a vision to restore the moon's atmosphere. Evidence pointed to there having been one millions of years ago, and some of the elements needed were below the surface. Perhaps he only had to heat the moon up a bit from within. Get those volcanic rocks and their water beads liquid again. All the decades of research had been downloaded, and he'd spent weeks filtering, looking for something someone had missed. But all the experts had said it was impossible to bring the atmosphere back to the moon, unless he was able to get about 1,000 comets from the Oort cloud to collide with it, then increase the rotation. But that would cause massive problems for Earth. He couldn't believe it. He would find the solution. Something easier, that wasn't going to affect the gravity of the moon too much. Perhaps, if he had found the solution sooner, he could have saved his friends. They'd gone outside only a few years ago, wanting to be free again. They had taken their helmets off while the robots happily bounced around their silently screaming faces, boiling eyes, and crumpling bodies. He'd cried for weeks, then been angry for months. Stuck on this lunar landscape with nothing to do besides watch videos and learn, he was going crazy. Cabin fever crazy. Perhaps he would join them, but he was now too big to fit into any of the suits, and the airlocks wouldn't let him outside without one. But, at least he had a vision. No one else seemed to have one. Live, work, have children, die. Nothing changed here. Endless moon dust and craters, and those bloody mechanoids jumping about chasing things. If he could just get hold of a gun he could shoot out their cells, if they had any. He hated those little robots. Lunar Base 1, population, 20,000. David finished programming the lecture about restoring the moon's atmosphere, and turned to the latest HoloNews report. More kids had taken their helmets off. Another year, another group of kids die. He wondered why people kept having them here, knowing the mental health risks. Perhaps people were just lonely, Or perhaps sex was the natural thing for humans to be doing when they were safe, and there really wasn't anything else to do. With endless drone deliveries from Earth, and all new research programs temporarily cancelled, there really was nothing to do but pretend everything was normal and continue to perform as before, while people tried to work out what to do. None of the governments of the world had money to fund a return trip for any of them. Especially as the population had exploded, and most of the people born on the moon could never live on the higher gravity surface of Earth. But waiting for droid food shipments was really the only excitement left. And having babies. He recalled farmers hundreds of years ago, having 8 or more children to make sure at least a few survived to take over the farm. That's what they'd ended up doing on the moon. Extending the habitat, eating, having sex. Of course, many had chosen courses that would enable them to continue the work here, but now that the first ones had started dying, some of the maintenance work was being left unmaintained. He knew that if the governments of the world could no longer finance a pickup, it wouldn't be long before they stopped sending food. The farm racks weren't up to feeding 20,000 people, so he shuddered to think how things would get. Would they end up eating their dead? He looked across at the deeply dug ring surrounding the domes, relieved that he couldn't see the robots now. There was something disturbing about happy robots playing where many children had just boiled their eyes. Lunar Habitat 1. Population 50,000. The moonquakes had started as a slight tremor a few years ago. Now they were practically shaking the domes. If anything, it had stopped the deaths, as now the children wanted to save each other. Many of the older ones had begun trying to find ways to redesign the new parts of the habitat to withstand a moonquake. Theories that the ice they had mined from the moon's south pole might be affecting the structural integrity of the body had been dismissed. Even so, there hadn't been these many moonquakes in so short a time. David had become quite concerned about the bodies piling up. Decompression had killed several families in Block 37, but they weren't mourned by most. It had become a ghetto over the past 15 years, with uneducated people stealing chemicals and getting high, and having endless children, even though the lunar colony now had a government, a police force, and a constitution. It was starting to become a kind of dictatorship as more freedoms were taken away and there was now mandatory condom use and abortions. The recent forced abortions had caused quite a furor, and there had even been protests, but they really couldn't argue, now that food deliveries had stopped. Of course, all the government tried to distract everyone by changing the name of the lunar base for the younger generation. David guessed this would become a tradition. More domes had been printed with more food racks, and many had taken the anti-food pill so that one small meal a day was sufficient. But the severe boredom continued to take its toll. Someone had rigged one of the airlocks so that a spacesuit wasn't necessary to leave, and it was now known as the death lock. Worse than that was the moon government seeming to be complicit in it, even posting a bulletin that if anyone wished to commit suicide for the sake of the community, they would be honored, and their families compensated with extra food. David stared out the window at the churned moon's surface. The ring was now so wide and deep that the wall printers couldn't build a bridge across it, even if they had wanted to. The moon buggies had all worn out years ago, so leaving the area wasn't possible anyway. Not that there was anything worth seeing. The robots were a low priority, but David saw them as a sign of a long ago age, no longer relevant. They were almost mocking. How dare they have their fun while people died? His table shook. Another moonquake. His desk reported what the increasing whine had already told him. Decompression again. David looked at the warning signal in horror. The farm racks on the east side. LH1, population 40,000. David's tears dropped onto his wife's cold corpse. She had died that morning, her heart simply giving up. With the new government and a new exercise regime, as well as a death penalty punishment if rules weren't obeyed, LH1 had finally been coming together again after years of stagnation, corruption, and drug addiction. But his wife had let her depression and anxiety about the future eat her from inside. She didn't commit suicide like many others. She had simply willed herself to death. No matter how he smiled, what he brought her, the visions he told, how he helped her in every way, nothing could break her despondency at their existence. She had spent her last years watching old documentaries of Earth, knowing that, as she'd been born on the moon, she could never go there. David wiped his eyes. His med scanner said she had had cancer, but it hadn't been that had killed her. Not exercising, not doing deep breathing, working to exhaustion in the farm rack rooms, and constantly worrying. A slower, more painful death than one of the death locks. He shook his head. At least they hadn't had any children. David got up and looked at himself in the mirror, his eyes red, his body gaunt. The food pills had used every fat cell in his body, and he was now as thin as a pipe. His med scanner said he was in peak health for a loony, but his mind said otherwise. He heard the stretcher arriving, and one of the nurses came and gave him a hug. It felt like a dream. He wished it were. He knew they would take her body away and use it for fertilizer in the farm racks. That's all anyone was good for these days. He leaned over and kissed his wife's cold cheek as they carried her past, and then saw figures of his friends appearing near him, consoling him with words, putting their arms around him, shadows in his daze, as they followed her like a funeral procession to the recycling chamber. He knew he was thin enough to fit into a suit now. After the funeral, after he had settled everything, perhaps it would be time to join her. LH1, population, 20,000. The meteor strike had come during a particularly strong moonquake, and half the habitat had decompressed. David was part of the workforce set to repair and restore. It had happened not long after his wife had died, and the disaster had put things into perspective. With plenty of water in the moon's South Pole area, they never had to worry about oxygen, but with much of it stored in solid ice, if the heating and conversion equipment ever got damaged, that would be the end of the habitat. Of course, this area on the east side was the most important. Just touching the sunlit area while the rest of the base was forever in darkness. Surrounded by extra reinforced walls, a small force field, several airlocks, and a 24-hour round-the-clock personnel, it seemed that the hospital area had absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the habitat. This one was for saving lives, the other part of the moon was for living them. Even so, with the wall printers irreparable, and many things no longer working, it would only be a matter of time before this place was compromised too. At least he had a friend here. She worked in the hospital area and kept him focused on his goal. If he could succeed in his vision, he knew at least one person would appreciate it. But, could it be done with what little resources he had here? Heat the moon from within, release the water and oxygen from the rocks? The drill and extractor were too small to do anything. What he needed was something big. Something as big as the habitat dome. But he needed a huge amount of salt too. The ice wasn't going to give up its oxygen by itself. He looked out the window of the east side and saw the little robot and the dog climb up out of the ring to walk to the sunlight and recharge. 60 years of doing that. Surely, they were sentient by now. Adjusting to each change, learning. He wondered what they thought. The robot throwing the bone, the robot dog chasing after it and bringing it back. As they came closer, he saw it. The bone that the robot dog had in its mouth. It wasn't a robot bone. It was some kind of long piece of rock. It looked like a lump of iron. But, where did they get that? So, the ring hadn't just been created from them just running. Each time the dog couldn't find the bone, it dug around. It might have simply kept digging, finding new bones to fit the program. Had they dug anything else up? The moon had so much that the habitat couldn't extract. Even the smelter no longer worked. But they had smaller operations. They could burn hydrogen or use electrolysis or grind and sift ore. David suddenly became more excited than he had ever been in his 65 years of life. He turned to the nurse. Dolores. I am just going outside, and I may be some time. You're not, you know. She looked worriedly at him. David laughed. And suddenly realized he hadn't laughed in decades. No. Definitely not. I've had an idea. See you soon. He left, and went to the spacesuit rack. As one of the oldest, and most trusted, he had full access to the entire base. Probably only the nurses had more unrestricted access. He unlocked his storage compartment and checked his suit. No one had used the spacesuit he had been allocated as a young adult, too tall for everyone else, and he quickly put it on, plugging in a new oxygen cylinder, and checking all the attachments and closures. He then headed for one of the death locks and went outside. The robots were on his left, but he no longer felt any need to turn them off. They seemed to nod and smile at him. Another forgotten subroutine? Perhaps they were programmed to communicate, but no one ever did. He went over to them and looked them over. Their design was strange, and there were non-English markings on some of their shells. The main one had a bulbous head and a vaguely humanoid shape. The smaller one looked like a, what? He'd never paid them any attention. But, he just realized it wasn't a dog at all. It was some kind of cat-like robot. Someone's joke. There were also some kind of digging tools instead of toes or claws on its feet. Who designed these? He shook his head and bounced over to the edge. The dirt ring looked to be meters deep. Something glowed at the bottom. Ice. They dug down to the ice layer. He checked his readings. Even lower than the surface. Below -153 degrees Celsius. He used his heads-up display to zoom down. Dirt, frost, prints, rocks, and dust. And something else. Analysis confirmed it. Salt. Salt. On the moon? He couldn't believe it. Perhaps a comet had hit here eons ago, bringing a salt lake with it? He looked back at the robots and they seemed to shrug at him, the dog-cat's robot face making a smile. How? Our plan, said a voice. We see all realities. We saw your future. You were dying. You needed elements to survive. But, you've been here for decades, playing with a bone. Time is different to us. It is the process that is fun. Enjoy the process. Things will be ready when they are ready. But, when? Soon. David looked at the ice and salt below and then back at the robots. He'd heard soon from politicians. It usually meant 100 years or more. How many orbits around the sun, specifically? The robot seemed to laugh, his signal coming through the suit as a friendly hee-hee. You decide. The process is waiting for the next step. We changed our programming so that you always saw us. Did you realize? A base this big, circumference this wide, yet you always saw us. We've been waiting for you. David's mouth opened, then closed again. They had been waiting for him. To do what? Grow up? He knew what it was. Waiting for him to escape from his normal human existence and just look up, to become aware. To pursue the passion that was unique to him. Had they heard all his talk about an atmosphere? No. They had known before he had even thought about it. Before he had been born. The ice was now available. There was enough salt there to create a local atmosphere. But he had no equipment to heat it all. And it wouldn't last long, anyway. The robot seemed to read his mind. It pointed at the sunlight streaming across the eastern part of the base. David looked at the light. His internal temperature was 24 degrees, but the heated area of the base was over 100. If he could concentrate the light down into the cold side and all around the ring, into the ice, he could heat it. But he didn't have magnifiers big enough. You will work it out. Follow the process. The timing will be right. Just then, a moonquake rocked the habitat, and David saw a plume of oxygen explode from a joint in Section 40. His 60-year mission temporarily forgotten again, he bounced back to the death lock, ready to merge back into the repetitive human life and death phases of the moon base. He would be needed. Moon Base 1. Population, unknown. Half the base had been closed off. Many of the walls dismantled and repurposed to keep the rest running. David took his breath and steadied himself. He'd started losing his balance as soon as he'd hit 80. He thought it would happen later, with the lower gravity, but everything seemed to be right on time for a human. The collapse of Section 47 had led to other disasters, not least of which was the myriad of deaths that had followed when they'd run out of some of the harder-to-get antiviral components. Hard to believe they'd lost so many people in just 15 years. But there had been an uptake in the sciences from the remaining population, and everyone had worked together to create something that the moon base had needed all this time. A fully functioning force field that stretched above the dome and over the ring. There wasn't enough oxygen generated to be able to fill it, but the field was solar-powered so would operate indefinitely. And with no deliveries from Earth in years, there was no need to ever shut it off. Playing with the magnification of the field meant they could also redistribute the heat. Now the whole moon base area received the sunlight, not just the east side. This meant more power for other life support systems. He'd lost track of things in the past 5 years. Memories weren't forming as well as they used to, and physically there wasn't much he could do besides answer questions. He'd stopped following law changes, or the population figures. He only knew that they had a democratically elected government, and the scientists were in charge. The death locks were no longer, their name changed to simply doors, and the population was starting to do things like go for walks around the base in their spacesuits. The robot and the cat were jumping about a lot, but he hadn't seen the robot throw anything, nor the cat catch it. He recalled their conversation and knew he had been right. Soon could mean 100 years to something as long-lived as a robot. Falling again, he grabbed hold of the pipe along the wall, and it came off in his hand. He raised his eyes. Entropy was spreading through the space faster than they could recreate, repair and replace. Would he actually outlive it? Be the last one standing? He stumbled again as the world began to swim in front of his vision. Vision. What had been his vision? To restore the atmosphere? He felt pain in his left arm, and knew he didn't have much longer. His heart was reaching its end, too. He had to complete his mission. He went to where he had hung his suit. The dome was secure for the moment. The force field was holding. There hadn't been a cleanup needed in a few days. He could finally turn his attention to his goal again. And those robots would help. He might have weeks, months, or days. He had no idea, but he wasn't going to waste another moment. He carefully climbed into his suit, holding the nearest railing. He checked and double-checked the clasps. He couldn't remember whether he had done it properly. Had he missed one? He checked again. He looked out the window and saw the gaily jumping specks in the distance. They were there. They're waiting for him to look. Slowly, he stumbled his way to one of the doors and went out onto the surface. The force field had recently had a temperature filter programmed into the energy bubble. The temperature was a balmy 30 degrees, but he couldn't take his helmet off to be sure. The robot and its cat climbed up and met him halfway. "It's time," said the robot. "Really, really?" David asked, unbelievingly. "We have some unfortunate news, for you, though. The atmosphere can never be returned to the whole moon. Terraforming the moon would cause problems for your home planet. It would increase the moon's gravity, change the tilt, increase the rotation, and these slight changes would dramatically affect the tides on Earth. Not to mention the shape of the orbit. With many humans having sleepless nights when the moon is at perigee, what effect do you think it will have on them if it was closer? It would be too dangerous for your race." David looked at the robot, sadly. Of course, he'd known this for years. But he had been trying to find a way around that. Perhaps only a little bit of an atmosphere? But he knew that the robot was right. Even if he could bring air to the whole moon now, it wouldn't be long before it was overloaded with people and supplies from Earth. And then they'd all be in trouble. It was over. If he could have laid down in a fetal position, curled up and just died there, he probably would have. But his suit stopped him from bending. The most he could do was fall to his knees. Then the robot looked him in the eyes. But there is something we can do. David looked at the robot with hope again. What's that? We waited until you had your force field in place. David looked at the sky and could see the faint shimmer causing the stars to twinkle. Why? The robot cat pointed at the dugout ring and spoke for the first time. I dug in a spherical way. It curves under. Your force field dome is now a force sphere, meeting at the bottom of the asteroid that had buried itself here. A part of our planet. A piece of land from one of its oceans. A piece of a planet. We are from a planet that your ancient records call Maldek. When your moon base began to warm the area, we woke up. We scanned for Maldekians, but there weren't any. So, we monitored your signals, copied your brain waves, and worked out what our new mission would be. And what's that? David was getting too tired, confused and disoriented to be able to follow the conversation. Wasn't Maldek now the asteroid belt? It had exploded millions of years ago. A piece of Maldek, resurrected here, on the south pole of your moon. A celebration of what was lost and what is to come. A new phase for your moon. You don't need to do anything further besides maintain the system. All is prepared, and it is quite a simple engineering feat. All it needed was time, and one more thing. Both robots then made a solemn bow, raised their hands and said, "To your future." Then they bounded happily away. Where were they going? What was the one more thing? The robots ran to the edge, jumped in, and exploded. David covered his eyes as the flash, electrical charges, and following shockwave reverberated around the base. Suddenly, more explosions came as ice converted to hydrogen and oxygen, mineral deposits puffed and reacted, and steam was released. Freezing cold puffs of moist air sparkled and blew around him. Specks of snow, frost, and even rain swirled in the air inside the energy sphere. He guessed this was what skydivers on Earth felt, passing through a cloud. He stumbled to his feet as the gases buffeted him, and made his way back to the moon base, struggling to stay upright in the low gravity. He checked his environmental readings, and stopped. He couldn't believe it. He checked again. His suit said the atmosphere around him was now similar to the air composition of Earth, but with slightly higher oxygen for his moon colleagues. Had the robots really programmed everything? Even the percentages? Almost regretfully, he carefully unlocked his helmet. Like many of his friends before him, he was taking his helmet off outside. The nightmare images of children's boiling eyes came back to haunt him. He knew now that would never happen again. This time his eyes wouldn't boil. This time, he would be the first human, staring without a helmet across the moon's landscape. Free. He pulled off his helmet, feeling the slight heat of the air, the chill of the newly released gas, particles of dust and, for the first time, wind on his face. He looked at his hands, his vision blurred from age but not from the air. He was out. He was on the surface of the moon. He was breathing on the surface of the moon. His heart beat faster at the idea as the wind whipped about the base. He pressed buttons on the helmet, alerting the others, then he bounced over to the windows. He waved, he jumped about, he whooped for joy. Could they see him? But there was no one to see. Only he had been watching the robots all this time. No one had ever looked out the windows after many years of seeing the same sights. They'd long forgotten how. Even the flash of the explosion, and the wind, and the now frosting glass of the base had been ignored. They had forgotten what it was like to have wonder, to consider future possibilities, to always be looking for the next thing. David's tears of joy quickly became tears of bitterness and despair. He slumped against the side of one of the glass panels, watching frost appear on the dirt in front of him. Watching it darken with moisture. The colony had failed where it had mattered most. There was no one left with his excitement, his joy. He had never felt more alone in his life. He looked to the very top of the energy dome where he could see clouds starting to form. Perhaps they would get rain. Just then, he heard the sound of a door opening near him. Sound, on the moon. Someone had seen. Excitedly, he turned. A small head popped out. Then another, and another. Children. Children. What? Can we come out and play? Said one curly head. Another with long hair said, please, sir. David stared at them, dumbfounded. Where had these children come from? He thought there weren't any left. And, of course, they'd seen. Only the children could see. A woman followed them out. A nurse. They'd had coffee recently. She had been there when his wife had died. Of course. Dolores. I couldn't believe them at first, she said. But then I saw you there with your helmet off. Grinning, and not dying. David looked at the children and back at Dolores. Our secret, she said, pressing a finger to her lips. I always knew you would do it eventually, David. She went over, hopped and floated up to reach his full height, and kissed him on the forehead before floating down again. I was one of your students in your class 50 years ago, remember? While you worked on the scientific side, I worked on the human side. She pointed at the kids, playing in the dirt, running and laughing, looking at the earth high in the sky. My grandchildren. The nurses have special rules, remember? Whatever happens, this moon base will always need nurses. She put her arm around him and helped him to stand. How long will the air last? He pointed at the ground. The robots had designed it around our developments. The heat will keep the water evaporating, and the force field will keep breaking water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. I'll make some adjustments to the field to let excess hydrogen out, but we now have air and fuel for a very long time. Somehow, we'd chosen a place directly above quite a unique asteroid impact crater. There are enough minerals down there to start a farm. Enough to live here for hundreds of years. A single tear dropped down her face, and she wiped it away and sniffed. Oh, silly me. Nurses can't show their emotions, can they? They can to people who love them, said David. She held him tight, and they both watched the children laughing and playing on the surface of the moon. Free again.